Rabbi Julia Andelman here, Director of Community Engagement at JTS, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the first session of our spring semester webinar series, The Other in Jewish Text and Tradition. Welcome to all of those who've been joining us for the last many months in our online learning, and welcome to all those who are joining us for the first time today. I just wanted to say a word about this new series. For those who participated in the first big webinar series that we launched after the pandemic hit us, the theme there was times of crisis and opportunity. And our thinking was, here we all are in a moment of crisis. And perhaps it could be something of a comfort to us to remember that this is not the first crisis that the Jewish people have lived through. And what can we learn from previous crises, and what light can previous crises and the opportunities that they gave rise to shed on our current moment. And we used that launching pad to look at all kinds of eras in Jewish history and theology and community that didn't have direct bearing on the pandemic, but that again helped sort of help us think more broadly about our moment of crisis. So I mention that for those who participated in the series, because I think our thinking is somewhat similar for this new series on The Other. So I don't need to tell anyone on this Zoom call the extent of the polarization that we're living with now. I mean, right now it's right at the top. Several headlines that aren't about the pandemic directly seem to be so frequently about cultural clashes, political divides, racial, socioeconomic. I could go on and on. And our thinking again was clashes with the other, and the idea of me as opposed to you, we are two different things, is not a new concept either. So let's look back into Jewish history and thought and explore the many places where these gaps and divides and different identities and identifying someone else as other than you, et cetera, where does that come up, and how might that help us reflect on our current moment? So that's what we're going to be doing over the coming semester, looking at a huge range of those polarizations, some political and some racial, but also Jews and non-Jews, Jews and new Jews, born Jews and new Jews, as we're going to be learning about today, men and women, our gods, our God and other people's gods, different, the other in terms of stature in society, many cases, and even in a couple of months, human beings and animals, which the Jewish tradition has a lot to say about. So that's what we're embarking on together, looking at other, no pun intended, setups of different groups or different individuals, and kind of polarized or contrasting identities, and putting our current moment and the struggles of polarization now into the context of that history. So I just wanted to say that to introduce our new series, and perhaps Professor Kraemer will say more as well. We're so pleased to have Professor David Kraemer kicking off the new series, as he has in the past. The session today is The Challenge of Accepting the Other. And as I mentioned, this is about what we learn about our own identity as a Jewish community, as Jews, from how our tradition and our community has responded to people wanting to join us. So I think it's a wonderful way to start the series, really honing in on that question of identity. I think that's actually, those are all. I'll just actually briefly introduce Professor Kraemer. His full bio is on the source sheet, but As you may know, he is the Joseph J. and Dora Abbell Librarian at JTS. And he's also served as professor of Talmud and Rabbinics for many years. As librarian, Professor Kraemer is at the helm of the most extensive collection of Judaica, rare and contemporary, in the Western Hemisphere. On account of the size and importance of the collection, Professor Kraemer is instrumental in setting policy and establishing vision for projects of international importance, which he does beautifully and with great vision. He's also a prolific author and commentator. You can read his book titles in his bio, but he just came out with a book last year, A History of the Talmud from its Origins to the Present Day, which has gotten rave reviews. So on that note, I'm going to turn things over to Tani Schwartzhermann, who's going to share some logistical instruction, and then we'll begin our learning together.
Thank you, Rabbi Andelman. Also excited to welcome all of you here to the first session in this series, and it's so nice to see so many people joining us for our first session. Just to go over a couple of things about the Q&A. Dr. Kraemer will pause for questions periodically throughout the class. We will also have some time for Q&A at the end. You can use the chat feature to submit your question to Rabbi Andelman. To open the chat, hover your cursor over the bottom of the Zoom screen and click on the chat icon. During the Q&A period, Julia will select a few of the questions to present to Dr. Kraemer. Please note that you will only be able to chat with JTS staff. You will not be able to send messages to the group or to Dr. Kraemer. For technical and logistical questions, please initiate a private chat with myself or with Lynn Feynman. And I'm going to go ahead now and turn it over to Dr. Kraemer.
Okay, can I be heard? Shake your heads, yes. Okay, great, super. Let me just change my view here so that I'm not going to see a lot of people, but I can see some of you. You should have noted that the text that we're going to be using is in the chat. So please, feel free to pick it up over there. And thank you, Julia, for the conceptual introduction to the series and very nice and warm introduction to myself as well. I would say that it's great to see all of you, but the truth is I can only see about 25 of you who's at any given time when your little boxes appear on my screen. So I'm going to just imagine all of you and hope that you are well and that together we can engage in some interesting discussion while we wait for the time that we can reemerge into the world and enjoy one another's company more directly. This series, I think, is remarkably important, important at this time and important in general at this time for reasons that Rabbi Andelman just said. Important in general because human beings have a habit, this is all human beings, have a habit of organizing into groups and setting those groups over and against others who are not members of that group. And if we want to understand any human society, any human group, who they think they are, who they think they are not, it's probably best to ask the question that we're asking here, which is, who is the other? What constitutes the other? You could also express the same question by saying, who constitutes the self? But as we know about both thought and language, the way we define ourselves, and just think of the word define, we're setting a boundary. We're setting ourselves off over and against something else, something that we are not, that other. So I can say in positive language who I am, but inevitably the statement who I am or who we are will at least imply something about who we are not. And What that means is that consideration of the other actually is a very important insight into the identity of any group, small or large. This can be, we can imagine, I mean, socioeconomic groups, national groups, racial groups. I mean, it literally applies to any kind of grouping that humans might form. Now, to take that one step further, it's also very interesting to ask, and this is a natural extension of what I just said, uh, can someone who begins as other, someone else, can they join your group? Can they become you? And under what circumstances can they become you? There's certainly certain kinds of groups that don't permit the other to become part of the group. If you look at the way noble society or royal society in Europe through the centuries defined itself, if you didn't begin as part of that nobility or part of that royalty, there were times that it was literally impossible to become part of that. As far as certain racially determined groups are concerned, if you're not part of that racial designation, whatever that means, and that always has to be defined, of course, and definitions will change. But whatever the definition is, if you are not part of that racial group, then you cannot join that group. So there will be some groups who will claim that the other, the outsider, cannot become an insider. But at the same time, there will be other kinds of groups that will admit the possibility of joining. Then the only question is who can join, under what circumstances, and what does our definition of who the other who can become the us they're joining, what does that teach us about our boundaries and who we are? There will be almost inevitably some others who can become part of your group under certain circumstances, and others who cannot. And so to become much more immediate about it, when we talk about Jews and Jews as a group, Jews and Jewish identity, when we want to look for, who are we and who are we not? Yes, there are many others we can look at, but I think an even finer tuning on that is to ask the question, who can become us? What does it mean to become a Jew? And when we look at that, what precisely it means to become a Jew, we of course learn a great deal about ourselves, about who we are, or at least aspire to be, and about whom we do not want to be. And that other, right, the one we do not want to be, is the one who will remain forever other. And so that's what we're going to jump in and explore here. A few preliminary words before looking at the specific question of conversion about Jewish identity as such. I've used the term Jewish already, I'm sure I haven't counted, but many times, a few dozen probably, in the course of my few minutes of introduction. But we should not take for granted what Jewish means or what to be a Jew means. Some of you, I'm sure, will know that today there is considerable debate among scholars of Judaism, the history of Judaism, when the word, either in Hebrew or Aramaic, so Hebrew Yehudi or Aramaic Yehudai, when did those words stop being the names of a people or tribe, right? First it was a tribe, then it became a people, the tribe of Judah, and then Judahites. When did those terms stop being the description of a tribe or a people and begin to be the description of someone who subscribes to a particular set of practices and beliefs that we call Judaism, right? It's not obvious when that occurred, and I've got to tell you that there are some scholars on the more radical end of the spectrum who think that the word Jew did not mean what we take it to mean, that is to say, someone who subscribes subscribes to a set of practices and beliefs until far more recent centuries than you might expect. At the earliest, the transition from being a Judahite to being a Jew occurred 1st or 2nd century BCE. Almost certainly not before that, and the transition may have been later as well. And so if we were to go to someone called the dominant language for most Jews of the time would have been Aramaic, someone who referred to themselves as Yudai, if we went to them in the 2nd, 1st century BCE, 1st century of the Common Era, and said, what does it mean to be a Jew, Judahite? They may have responded, first and foremost, it means to be the member of a people. Then the question arises, well, can someone who doesn't begin as a member of that people become a member of that people? And if someone accepts the practices but is not born as a member of that people, what does that make them? Conversion would seem to imply that the identity of what you're converting to can be acquired, and we would all grant that, but it's actually more complicated than that. In order to enrich this discussion, I want to make sure to refer to more contemporary considerations as well. And so I ask you to think, how many Jews of the 20th century would have said, and this may include many of you or people in your communities, how many would have said, well, I'm not religious as a Jew. I don't consider myself to be Jew as a religious identity, because they may have denied actually religious identity, but to be a Jew means to be a member of a people as well. And Jewish peoplehood was a very important category and continues to be a very important category for Jews in the modern world. Just to play this a little bit differently, and here I'm going to tell you from the beginning a little bit of my personal experience because it affects the way I think of this, and I invite you to make the connections and ask me about this as we go forward. On the one hand, growing up in a family that was predominantly secular, I had, excuse me, many members of my family who would have said to be Jewish means to be a member of a people, but not to be religious. You don't need to be religious to be a Jew. That was on the one hand. I often heard that in an interesting indirect way, where there would be a discussion of someone in the extended family who was going out with or was going to marry someone who was not born as a Jew. So you would hear a statement, and I'm sure many of you have heard such statements as well, that so-and-so is not marrying a Jew, they're marrying a convert, right? And my response in my head when I heard such statements was, wait a second, if they converted, they're Jewish. But the person who made the statement, they're not marrying a Jew, they're marrying a convert, obviously had something different in mind when they thought of the term Jew. You also need to know that for reasons of historical accident, my father was a convert. He was born to a mixed marriage family. My paternal grandmother was not a Jewish woman when she was married and gave birth to my father. She converted later. And so both my grandmother and ultimately my father were converts. And so this discussion affects me in very personal ways as well. And that's, I think, what you need to know by way of introduction and background as we jump into the sources. Before we do that, though, I just want to invite any questions that you might have about what I've laid out in introduction. Remember that you can use the chat for this purpose.
I haven't, just to remind everyone, if you want to ask a question of Professor Kraemer, you can send it to me, Rabbi Julia Andelman, in the chat. Professor Kraemer, I haven't received any questions about your intro yet.
Okay, let's just wait 25 more seconds to give people a chance to make sure, and then we'll jump in.
Great.
I see someone with a hand up on their screen.
So we're not.
That's not going to work,
Yeah.
unfortunately, because there are too many screens, right? So whoever has got your hand up on your screen, send it via chat to Rabbi Andelman, please.
So I'll just give you some headlines, Dr. Kraemer.
Yes.
And again, I think you'll probably address some of these in your teaching. There's a question wanting to understand the role of the Beit Din, the court overseeing the conversion, especially given all of the political issues with conversion in Israel today. There's a question asking, who are the Yirei Hashem in Hallel, the God-fearers that are apparently not Jews? What about Jews who marry non-converts?
You mean Jews who marry Jews, or Jews who marry Christians or Muslims? Or okay, we'll keep that in mind. Go ahead.
I think the latter. Why did
Okay.
the sages feel it was necessary to go beyond how Ruth converted? Is there a modern term for one who embraces the Jewish people and lives a Jewish life versus converting for religious reasons? Lots of questions.
Okay, good. So
Yeah.
what that means is that people are beginning to think about this, and you're right that I will address many of these things as we jump in. So rather than responding to individual questions now, we'll see what I answer and what I don't, we'll see where it leads. There's a lot of material here to consider, and yes, it is very politicized, because this is, as I said a few moments ago, a fundamental question of identity, really fundamental. Not only Jew versus the outside world, but since different groups will accept converts in different ways and with different considerations, this question is also about who I am as a Jew versus who you might be as a Jew. Ironically, there is othering here, Jewish group to Jewish group, and part of the way that comes to expression is through the conversion procedures and limitations. I will add here, and I'll bring this up as it becomes part of the discussion, that one of my closest friends is the chief rabbi of Poland. Actually, some of you may know him, Michael Shudrich. He is a rabbinic graduate both of JTS and of Yeshiva University. And he works constantly on these questions because he often has people who discover that they had Jews in their family going back to the time of the war, that after the war Jewish identity was hidden. They've rediscovered that identity, and they want to affirm their identities as Jews. Sometimes it's straightforward. More often it's not straightforward at all. And the question of who can convert and under what conditions is constantly being negotiated between Batei Din, courts in Israel, the notoriously difficult London Beit Din, and so forth. So there's much to be said here. Okay, let's go back and start with something very simple. First of all, it does need to be said, this will surprise nobody, that attitudes towards conversion and converts have changed considerably through the centuries on the one hand. At the same time, it's not actually on the one hand, on the other hand, but at the same time, there have always been simultaneously multiple opinions regarding conversion and converts. And I think part of what we'll find is that most of what we see in modernity has ample precedent in pre-modern expressions. In order to go back to the sources, we will go back to Talmudic texts. I'll make a quick reference to biblical texts before we look at the Talmud, but there following we'll look at medieval commentary on the Talmudic texts and expand the conversation beyond that. But you will find that as Kohelet, as Ecclesiastes said, there's really nothing new under the sun once this is established as a category. So there is some debate among scholars concerning whether there was conversion in what we would describe the late biblical period. God-fearers was mentioned before. It seems clear to the overwhelming majority of scholarship that people may have accepted the one superior God, that is to say the God of Israel, as far as Israel was concerned. But that didn't mean that people who accepted the superiority of that God identified as Jews. There were in the late Second Temple period, so in the couple of centuries before the Common Era into the first century and even beyond, we do have evidence of non-Jews who were attracted by Jewish practice, who were persuaded, attracted to the Jewish God. But again, it doesn't mean, even if they observe Jewish ways, that doesn't make them Jews, because of course, in order to join a group, the group needs to admit you to membership. So the first time we have any record, not of conversion, there seem to be some early references to the possibility of conversion, 1st or 2nd century BCE, but how one converts and how one does this, how someone who begins as other becomes a Jew. That's very important for us exploring what is other and what is the we here. The first time we have such a record is in Talmudic materials themselves. And so you should all have gotten the link in order to look at that. Rabbi Andelman, should I share this on screen, or can I assume that everybody has got it? What do you think is best?
Either way, everyone should have received it. If you'd like to share it, you can. And just so people know, if Professor Kraemer shares the screen, on most devices, there should be a vertical line between his image, if you're in speaker view, and the text, and you can move that line to the left or right to change the size of the text.
Okay, so I'm going to expand this, and can you all see it on screen? So you should have multiple access to it. You don't need to know who I am. You already know that, and here's the material that we're going to be studying. So what I've done here is to include for you the earliest record we have of a complete conversion ceremony. This is in the Babylonian Talmud. It's the sources that are quoted claim to be early sources from the period of the Mishnah. There is scholarly debate about the actual dating of these sources, but I assume that they're relatively early rabbinic. And this lays out the procedure in a way that we can learn a lot from. We're going to interpret this together. So just so you know what you're looking at, for those of you who have access to the Hebrew, you'll find that interrupting the English paragraphs. In the English, the bolded words are the original words found in the Hebrew or Aramaic, and the words in between are explanatory from the translator. This is copied and edited down from the version that's available online. Sfaria is what it's called, S-E-F-A-R-I-A. So that's where I copied and pasted it from. It's free access, and you're welcome to go back there. I've cut out some of the explanation just to make it a little bit more streamlined. So as you can see, the sages taught with respect to a potential convert who comes to the court to convert at the present time, meaning in the rabbinic period, they, the judges, say to him, "What did you see that you come to convert? Don't you know that the Jewish people at the present time are anguished, suppressed, despised, and harassed, and hardships are visited upon them?" If he says, "I know and I am unworthy," then the court accepts him immediately. So I have two questions here, and I invite people who are quick with their chat function to offer a response. Number one, what seems to be the purpose of the first response of the court? Don't you know how difficult it is to be a Jew? And then of the follow-up, if they say I'm unworthy, then they're accepted immediately. Anybody have any thoughts on that?
I'm going to temporarily open the chat for anyone to post if you want to respond to Professor Kraemer's question. So just select, make sure you select everyone.
got anybody?
Sorry. Yes.
Okay, just go ahead.
An expression of humility, to push away.
Okay,
Sincerity.
so the question is whether the first point is to push away, right? And that is frequently the case, meaning frequently offered as an explanation. That's what I meant to say. But I'm not so sure whether the purpose is to push away, because you'll note what it describes is the condition of Jews under Rome in the post-temple period. It's not easy to be a Jew. We have a Yiddish way of saying that. It's not easy to be a Jew. And the court wants to make sure that the potential convert who approaches understands that. If they respond and say, I know and I'm unworthy. And Rabbi Endelman, you made the comment about the kind of humility that's embedded in that term. And I think that's exactly right. Someone needs to recognize that despite what might appear to be the low station of Jews in that world, and the historical reality was a little bit more mixed than that, but certainly there was an emotion of why is it that we find ourselves in such a difficult position. If the potential convert understands that nevertheless, this is a noble thing to be a Jew, right? Therefore, one must express humility. Then look at the translation. The court accepts him immediately. The Hebrew, mikabelin oto miyad. That's an extraordinary statement. If you think about the way conversion classes work today, I think it's fair to say that if you go to your local synagogue, whatever kind of synagogue it might be, and have someone who is interested in conversion, the response on the part of the synagogue, the rabbi or other, will be, well, that's fine, but let's take some time. And there will be a course in Jewishness and Judaism and so forth. And that will take a year, or it might take 2 years. Certainly it will not be immediately. Now, I've sometimes said what I just said and had people respond and say, well, yeah, but in this age, back at the time of the Talmud, everybody understood what it meant to be a Jew. As you'll see in a moment, that's not true. This is a ceremony of some basic education. And so this brings me to the question which is actually most urgent in our discussion, and that is, what is the attitude that this Talmudic text brings to the convert and conversion? Is the convert and conversion, is the convert welcome? Is this someone to be pushed aside, and so forth? I do want to remark here as an important historical footnote, because many of you have learned this in the past. It is frequently said that Jews do not encourage conversion. As we read this text, ask yourself whether that's true. Is it true that Jews do not encourage conversion, or is it true, maybe better stated, that Jews have never encouraged conversion, or at least welcomed conversion? Because let's remember, there is no single description of a people and its customs that extends throughout its history, certainly a people like ours that has lived since this period for many, many centuries. So let's go on and see what happens next. So the judges inform him of some of the lenient mitzvot and some of the stringent mitzvot. I only want to observe for you that, I mean, there's a perfectly good translation, but the word some of the lenient and some of the stringent, we might ask ourselves, what does some mean? All right, is it a half? Is it 3/4? You know, what percentage is the inadequate amount? If you look at the Hebrew, you'll see that the Hebrew actually means something different than the translation some. Miktzat means a few, a little bit. And so what's very clear about this text is that the intention is to share a simple list that fits into these categories. And our question therefore becomes, how long would this take? Is this a year's course? Is it a 6-month course? Or is it something quite a bit less than that? You'll see in a moment. So a little bit of the lenient mitzvot, a little bit of the stringent mitzvot, the inform of the sin of neglecting gleanings, forgotten sheaves, and the corner of one's field, these commandments to help support the poor. And about the the poor man's tithe, and they inform him of the punishment for transgressing. They say, be aware that before you came to the status, meaning before you become a Jew, if you ate forbidden fat, meaning fat forbidden to a Jew, no problem, because you weren't forbidden. Had you profaned Shabbat, you wouldn't have been punished. But now, if you've eaten forbidden fat, you are punished by karet, and if you profane the Sabbath, you are punished by stoning. Now, these are very, very basic categories. They're important to understand, to know that there are consequences and potentially punishments for being a Jew, but it doesn't mean that the potential convert has to sit down and study. Quite the contrary. I read this paragraph slowly. If we take it at its word, we're talking about an instruction of just a few minutes. So that's on the negative side. Now we go on a little bit further, and just as they inform him about the punishment for transgressing the mitzvot, so they inform him about the reward granted for fulfilling them. They say to him, be aware that the world to come is made only for the righteous. Interestingly, not just for Jews, though they seem to believe that Jews might have easier access because we've got the Torah, but for the righteous. And be aware that the Jewish people at the present time are unable to receive their full reward in this world. They're not able to receive either an abundance of good nor an abundance of calamities. In other words, that the Jewish condition today doesn't allow for full justice to be worked out. And so there obviously must be a future world in which justice is finally realized. And now look very carefully. They do not overwhelm him is the translation. I'll come back to the Hebrew in a moment. And they are not exacting with him. I don't think the translator is right in saying that, first of all, overwhelm is not a good translation. I left it because you have to stick with your translation. And I'm not sure at all that it's referring to the threats. If you look at the Hebrew, it's very simple. Ein marbin alav means you don't go to too great lengths. You don't have a lot of this. You don't need to list a lot of mitzvot. You don't have to list a lot of punishments. Keep it short is the point. And ein medaktekin alav. You don't go into detail. So you don't go into abundance and you don't go into detail. And that is what is necessary by way of quote unquote education in response to the request of the potential convert. So I've just read through actually an ample part of this and had something to say about it. I'm curious, therefore, if you have any questions or comments before we go on to the next step. So please, through the chat, share what you might have.
All right, so Professor Kraemer, I have questions on this text, and I also have questions on everything under the sun related to conversion. Do you want me right now to just restrict them to this text?
Let's stick with the text, but give me at least a brief idea about where else people's minds are going.
They're in about 100 other places.
Okay.
also on the text.
Okay.
Okay. There were questions about the gendered language of the text, and does this apply to women in the same way?
It absolutely applies to women. In a piece of this actually that I may have cut out because I wanted to just abbreviate what I was sharing with you. There's a section that describes the differences in the conversion ceremony between males and females. So it unambiguously refers to both.
Great. How do we understand lenient versus stringent mitzvot?
Good question, and you're actually pointing to a problem with the translation. The problem with dealing with translations is that, there's always going to be some difficulty and some inaccuracy, and you have to decide what to deal with and what not. But since you've asked it, the meaning is not lenient and stringent in the way we generally mean that, but more literally lighter and more serious. Kalot and chamurot is the Hebrew, so lighter and more serious. And what it's referring to is the fact that there's certain commandments, the transgression of which the penalties are far more serious, and others that are a lot lighter, and that's the intent here.
Okay, I want to ask people if you can indulge me, just pause on sending me questions for the next couple minutes, because they're coming in like every 5 seconds and I can't read any of them because they keep bouncing up. So just give me a 5-minute hiatus on questions.
Okay, let's take another couple, then I'm going to go on and we'll see what comes back around, you know?
Okay. Actually, I'm just going to turn off the chat for a moment. Okay. So, okay, definitely questions about, I'll read a few for you.
Go ahead, please.
I'm not attributing names right now because they're just a lot on similar topics, but there's some skepticism that the text is not meant to discourage. So there are a few questions along those lines. There are questions about the does immediately really mean immediately, and someone notes, it sounds like a starter set of observance. Would these be all the convert was immediately responsible to observe, adding more knowledge and responsibility as they continued?
Okay, so those are good questions. Let me stop there. So first of all, let me respond to the skepticism and the question of immediately. You'll see the very next text, which you have in front of you, but I've now put on screen under the page break. If he accepts everything upon himself, they circumcise him immediately. Right? Kibel, if he accepts it, malin oto miyad. Now, that word kibel, accept, is a very important word, and I will come back to it. But I see absolutely nothing in this text to suggest that immediately means anything but its literal meaning, particularly because of the repetition. In addition, we take for granted that part of the conversion ceremony is education. And we know that it's, there's a lot that's involved in being a Jew. It seems to me obvious that this text actually has no such interest. It doesn't assume that part of the conversion ceremony is a proper education in what it means to be Jewish, perhaps because when, we think about these texts come from ancient, so let's say 2nd, 3rd century Roman Palestine. It's not a Jewish controlled territory, but there are of course many Jews who live there, and the non-Jews who lived in the same territory, the Jews whom they saw, they would have known what their practices were. They would have, had a sense of what it meant to be Jewish. It's very, very different in our world, where the most Jews whom potential converts see probably don't do anything at all. Right? And so if someone is interested in becoming a Jew, then a conservative rabbi has to ask him or herself, has to ask themselves, well, what does that mean as far as I'm concerned? How much do they need to know in order to do this properly? The same would be true in Orthodoxy or in Reform. It doesn't seem to be the issue here. What the issue is, I think we'll see in a moment. But what is very important is our recognition that, at least so far, this is going to be mixed, but at least so far, this text seems to offer us a very inviting and favorable view toward converts. Now, on the skepticism, I'm not sure why we've been taught so often that Jews didn't encourage converts. If that was meant to be a historical observation, then it's generally, but not always, correct. If it's meant to be an ideological observation, meaning Judaism is not in favor of converts, I think that's just flat out wrong. I don't agree that Judaism is not in favor of converts. I think there's ample evidence, some of which we'll see here, that Judaism is open to converts. Through the ages, there were times that Jews were forbidden under penalty of death to accept converts. And so beginning in the mid-4th century, when Roman Palestine became part of the Christian Empire, Byzantium, at that point, the law of the land indicated that to accept a convert to Judaism, or to take a convert, certainly from Christianity to Judaism, came with the death penalty. And this continued under church auspices throughout the ages. Under those circumstances, of course, it was not in Judaism's best interest to accept converts, because it came with serious danger. And the same was true under medieval Islam. But that should not be taken as indicative of the attitude of Judaism. There have been different attitudes informed by different fundamental beliefs about what it means to be a Jew. I think that answers the couple of things you said, Rabbi Andelman. Is there a little piece that I've missed, or can I go on?
Can you take one more question?
Yeah, please, go ahead.
Okay, so first, don't take this one because I know you're going to address it, but just all those people who are asking, who are remarking that it's interesting that there's no questioning the potential convert about motive. I suspect you're going to discuss that when you get to talking about the word kibel. So, okay, so everyone who asked that, it's coming. And then another question that a lot of people, or comment that a lot of people are making, is with the gleanings, for example, can we, or should we understand the text to be communicating kind of a priority of mitzvot, and sort of this is the essence, the rest is commentary kind of thing, and if so, so then right, you can extrapolate nice kind of ethical commitments around the gleanings being highlighted. If so, it seems like there are some things conspicuously absent. On the other hand, idolatry, for example.
Okay, that's a great question. And here what I'll say is as follows. As we will see in a couple of moments, the Talmud, what we were just reading, is the earlier rabbinic text from, the tradition claims it's from the period of the Mishnah. It's called the Baraita. And the Talmud will come back and itself comment on what we've just read. So we'll see what the Talmud thinks the reason is for selecting the gleanings mitzvah, for example. But just because the Talmud interprets it one way doesn't mean that we have to interpret it that way, because we've got the text in front of ourselves as well, and we can offer alternative interpretations. I think it's fair to interpret the ceremony or procedures we see here in multiple ways. They're very, very rich in meaning, and I think one of the meanings, not the only, but one of the meanings is that, yes, there is a certain priority here to this kind of mitzvah. There are other perspectives, though, as well. So let's jump back in. I'll open up again, and we'll get another few hundred comments for you to negotiate all at once, and then we'll see where that lives, where that leads to. So as I just read, if he accepts what's just come before, they circumcise him immediately. What I left out here was certain technical discussion about circumcision of adult males. I didn't think we needed to get into the details of that. So that's the 3 dots. When he is healed from the circumcision, they immerse him immediately, right? So first circumcision for males, then for everybody, the mikvah. And now look what happens. So here we are with either male or female convert, someone who's actually in the midst of the procedure of conversion. They are immersed, and 2 Torah scholars stand over him, right, at that time, and inform him of some of the lenient or the light mitzvot and some of the more serious mitzvot in terms of their penalties. Once he's immersed and emerged, he is like a born Jew in every sense. Now, this is a very, very rich piece. First of all, I want to ask, and this is only a rhetorical question because I'm afraid that with how many, with all of us, it's going to be impossible to really focus this down in chat. What's the purpose of doing again what you already did? Why, after the healing of the male, or the male and the female now in the mikveh, in the ritual bath as part of the conversion ceremony, do we once again have a recitation of the mitzvot? Right? That should be a puzzle to us. In order to answer that question, we've got to ask ourselves, who the model for conversion, and this I'm going to ask for a response on. Who's the model for conversion, right? When the rabbis look to a model, maybe a biblical model for conversion, who were their models? Who were the original converts, as it were? And here I'm going to warn you, this is a trick question, so please do answer, but I warn you in advance that I expect you to get it wrong, and there is no penalty for getting it wrong. So who are the biblical models for conversion?
All right, we're getting a lot of Ruths, an Abraham, Zipporah, Moses, a bunch of Abraham and Sarah.
Okay, Abraham and Sarah is the most common answer. Ruth is an excellent answer, and the rabbis actually use Ruth in a direct way as an answer. What's interesting is they do not use Abraham and Sarah. They quite consciously do not think of Abraham and Sarah as proper models of conversion, but quite the contrary. Moses is the closest to being correct there. It's the children of Israel at Sinai. Right? And this is elsewhere in the same discussion. I didn't quote it. But for them to convert means to stand at Sinai. What this means is that as far as the rabbis are concerned, the first actual converts to Judaism were Israel standing at Sinai, right? Who heard the Torah. That's why it's important to have a recitation of some of the mitzvot of the Torah, right? And in preparation for that, according to the rabbinic understanding of the biblical text, the males were circumcised. That's explicit in Exodus chapter 19, and everybody had to be bathed. Mikveh, where they were going to find a mikveh in the middle of Sinai is for other imaginations, but that is the basic model the rabbis offer. And so what that means is that the ceremony, the ritual we see here, reenacts the Sinai experience for the individual convert. That's quite intentional. The speaking out of the mitzvot of revelation. And what that means is that for the rabbis, and only for the current rabbis, we'll see, attitudes here are quite complex. For the rabbis, to be a Jew means to have stood at Sinai or to stand at Sinai. It means to accept. Now we come back to that word, kibel, Kabbalah. Some of you may know that according to the rabbis, the first two paragraphs of the Shema, the first paragraph of Shema is Shema Yisrael with the Ahavta, right? Hear, O Israel, with you shall love the Lord your God. And the second paragraph of the ritual Shema in the prayer book is from Deuteronomy chapter 11. It gives the rewards and punishment for observing the commandments, much as we have here. And the first paragraph is called Kabbalat, that's kibel, acceptance, Kabbalat Ol Malchut Shamayim, the acceptance of the yoke of the kingdom of heaven. And that is part of what's going on here. But then, more directly relevant, Kabbalat Ol Mitzvot, the acceptance of the yoke of the commandments. You hear a little bit of the punishment, you hear a little bit of the reward, you're standing at Sinai and you accept the covenant. That's what it means for these rabbis to be a convert. And so when you look at the latter part of what we just read, and as far as the rabbis, again, of this text are concerned, there is no racial element, peoplehood element to being a Jew. You'll notice how there's literally no mention of that anywhere in this discussion. And there's no part of a naturalization that indicates peoplehood as part of the ceremony. Instead, what you've got is a claim that to join us means to, as we did, accept the covenant of Sinai. And that's why they can say at the end of the paragraph that I had just read that someone who goes through this is like, you'll notice the translator includes as explanation a born Jew, and that's correct, but the Hebrew is more direct. He's a Jew, right? Or like a Jew in every sense of the word. Harehu ki Yisrael l'chol dvarav. As far as this text is concerned, there's no distinction whatsoever between the descendant of the Israelite who stood at Sinai generations ago and the individual who stands symbolically at Sinai through the conversion ritual ceremony today. They are identical. So that's what we've got so far. As we'll see in a few moments, it is going to become more complicated, I promise, but I just want to take a moment here to, to put you on the spot. Julia, I'm sorry to try, if there are comments or questions, just take a few before we go on.
I was just trying to comb through everything from before. Do you want to talk about the, well, I was going to say, do you want to talk about the Beit Din, since we've had some questions about that? And
what precisely is the question about the Beit Din?
I guess understanding its role, and also the question of 2 versus 3. We think of a Beit Din now, rabbinic or Jewish legal court, as being comprised of 3, the rabbis or observant Jews. Here it seems to be talking about 2 people.
Yeah, they are going to elsewhere in this discussion suggest 3 as a requirement. So that's just left out of the current discussion. The discussion of conversion in the Talmud goes on here for several pages, and there's another related text elsewhere. So you do need a court in the technical sense, and that is 3. Our discussions of do they need to be observant, not observant, I'll leave that for others. Yes, obviously the rabbis assumed that they and others who would constitute this group would be observant as they were, but the politics of this today are all about Jew versus Jew, who counts, who doesn't count. And so I'm going to leave that one aside, actually. Yes, a court is required, and it's a court of 3. Anything else on the text that I just completed?
I would say this qualifies as a yes. So a few people have asked about, and this goes again to this question of motive, but can you convert to being a secular Jew, right? Today we have a lot of different ideas about what it means to be Jewish, or some people do anyway. So, can we, how do we apply this, the way this text is framing conversion to the idea of converting to a form of Jewish life that's not focused on mitzvot, which many people might do today?
Yeah. For the rabbis, that wasn't a category. As we'll see going on, beyond the Talmudic rabbis, the question is, what do you think it means to be a Jew, right? So ironically, if to be a Jew is to be a citizen of a nation, and there I've chosen my language very carefully, then we live in an age where citizenship can be acquired. And so the question would be, why couldn't someone become a citizen of the Jewish nation without accepting its religious categories? But that, of course, requires us to imagine that that there's a difference between the Torah system and the Jewish system. Most Jews in modernity would say that there is, or many Jews would say that there is, but not all Jews. And through the ages, the answer would have been more complicated, as we'll see. I didn't say before, but one of the questions that comes in here, I've used the term peoplehood, but peoplehood, I mean, one of the ways we speak about peoplehood, we use the term race. race is a little bit more complicated, but they're not entirely different from one another. What does it mean to be a French person? The meaning of to be French was very different in the 16th century, or I should say in the 14th century, than in the 16th or 17th or 18th century. The definition of Frenchness changed over that time, of nationality changed over that time. So ethnos is the Greek term, which was used for being a Jew and other kinds of people. Can you become a member of a people? There's a lot of doubt about that. When we go to medieval thinkers and early modern thinkers, Judah Halevi, a poet whom some of you will know at least by reputation, is notorious for having considered Jewishness to be something imbued in the Jewish nation by God and, frankly, superior to other kinds of peoplehood, nationhood, not nation in the modern sense, but literally in the blood. The same is true of some of you will know the famous Maharal of Prague, later reputed to have invented the golem. Maharal of Prague writes that Jews are the Platonic form of human being. That there's an ideal form of human being, and Jews are the only ones who fit that category, and all other kinds of humans are less than ideal, and therefore, closer to animalness. Again, this is the Maharal, but interestingly, he goes on and corrects the extremity of what I just described by saying actually that any time you fail from the perfect, you immediately go to the lowest rung. And so if Jews can't be perfect, and by definition we can't be, even though ideally we would be Platonic human beings, the ideal of the ideal, in reality, we're often at the lowest rung. But the reason I mention this is because your assumption about what it means to be a Jew will affect the way we answer these questions. Can you convert and not take on religious practices? I don't know. That's a question for each and every one of us and the synagogues that we affiliate with, or the communities that we affiliate with. I want to go a little bit further, and I mean, a lot of this will come back up, but I'm looking at the time, and I note that there are actually some very important references for us to add to what we already have. This Talmud, up to now, I think the text that we quoted was actually quite favorable, but even the Talmud itself has some ambivalent feelings, or at least some of the authorities of the Talmud have some ambivalent feelings. So in the next paragraph, in the Talmud's comment on the response, which says you got to tell them the commandments and their punishments and so forth. In the middle of that English paragraph, you'll see what is the reason to say all of this to him. This notably is not on the claim that Israel suffers and is oppressed in our day, but just the fact that it's hard to be a Jew. So what's the reason? The answer is it's so that if he's going to withdraw from conversion, let him withdraw. And as the commentator says already at this stage, and that is in support of an opinion by one Rabbi Chelbo, and we're not going to discuss this now because we'll see commentaries on this in a few minutes, but Rabbi Chelbo said, converts are as difficult for Jews as a scab. That's a better translation than the one you've got here. If you look at the Hebrew above this, Amar Rabbi Chelbo, that part is underlined. Kashim gerim liYisrael kisapachat. Converts are as difficult to Israel, to the Jewish people, as a scab. One of the ironies here is that if we go back to the etymological source, sapachat is a biblical term for scab or sore. It's a good translation. Ironically, etymologically, the word for family, mishpacha, sapachat, mishpacha, comes from the same Semitic root. So I'm not going to ask anybody how you feel about your families. This is not intended to be preparation for, comic routines in the Catskills, but, it means to be very, very close. And that closeness can be a good thing or it can be not so good a thing. So when converts join the family, they might be very, very difficult, is what it says here. Clearly a negative statement, a very negative statement, and we'll see how it's interpreted as we go on. Just a couple of things before we jump forward, though. In the next paragraph, interestingly, the question that somebody asked before about why are the specifics, why do they focus on gleanings and forgotten sheaves and so forth? Excuse me. So you can see that Chia bar Abba, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, says, because a Gentile is executed even on account of stealing less than the value of a pruta, and a Gentile, the item a Gentile steals is not subject to being returned. The claim here is that Gentile law is less just and more cruel than Jewish law. That is to say that according to Gentile law, no matter how small the value of what a Gentile steals, he will be executed or she will be executed on account of stealing it. There's no possibility or no obligation, because no real possibility to return it, because you're going to be executed anyhow. This is a form of othering. And I just want to draw attention to it. As the Talmud discusses what it means to be or become a Jew, they are claiming that if you originate outside of Jewish practice and values, you began in a distinctly inferior, unjust, and you can add what other terms you like, position. And so you have to leave that behind. And there is certainly a sense in the conversion ceremony of leaving behind. Now, if you go, and I forgot that you've got this on screen in my version, so I'm going to skip here to the very end of at least the Talmudic text. Some people expressed some skepticism about the meaning of, what it means to do this immediately. How quickly are we, what are we speaking about? Now look at what the Talmudic interpretation says. So that same Baraita we read before had said, if he accepts it upon himself, then they circumcise him immediately. And the Gemara asks, the Talmud on this asks, so what's the reason to act immediately? Answer, because we do not delay the performance of a mitzvah. It seems to me clear here that the mitzvah is not circumcision as such. It's the circumcision that effectuates the conversion. And so what this text says in the end of its commentary is that accepting converts is a mitzvah. Right? Quite contrary to what some of you expressed before and what I said I don't see evidence of in any enduring sense. This is, as you can see, a Talmudic Judaism that not only doesn't hesitate to accept converts, but sees the acceptance of converts under defined circumstances as a mitzvah. And that's quite extraordinary. But again, what we've seen here is a very clear sense of who the other is and who we are. We are the people of Torah, according to everything we've seen in the Talmud. They are less than that, other than that, inferior to that. One thing we have not yet plumbed is the question of what does it mean when the isolated voice, but it's an important voice, says, yes, and when they join us, they're like a sore, a scab on our flesh. We need to take some time to make sense of that. But before we do that, are there, a couple of quick comments or questions that we can use to bridge to the medieval commentary?
I keep getting so many questions about motive. So,
okay.
So maybe we should address it. And I wanted to, in addition to all the questions that are coming in, maybe I'll throw in a little bit of mine. So so one of the things that I learned back when I was studying these texts closely before I was a rabbi was that at this stage, they were pretty unconcerned with motive. There kind of a split developed among Ashkenazim and Sephardim about what the meaning of the word kibel was. And one direction that went in was, having, what were you accepting upon yourself? Is it really the yoke of everything, or is it the yoke of all of the commandments, or is it, kind of this more minimal stuff that was just shared with you? And the relationship of that to motive. Meaning if you're marrying, for example, if you're converting, for example, to marry a Jew, which is probably the most common circumstance under which people convert today, then kibel, sort of receiving the more minimal set of mitzvot that you were just read, may be more comfortable than receiving the entire yoke of all of the commandments. So that's how I was connecting the idea of motive to.
So what I would say is, first of all, I think accept here does mean the whole system. It doesn't mean the isolated examples. The isolated examples are symbolic as part of the ritualized ceremony. But the assumption is that to become a Jew means to enter the covenant of Sinai, and the covenant of Sinai includes it all. Now, that, of course, is what the rabbis hope the motive is. And they hope that one approaches it with modesty, out of a recognition that this is a noble system. And that you are therefore unworthy of it. That's a very common ancient and medieval attitude. If something is distinguished, then you at least have to pretend that you believe that you are not worthy. Whether you actually believe you're not worthy is another discussion, but that's certainly part of it. Listen, during this period, while on the one hand, there's ample evidence of what we would call anti-Semitism. It's not properly that. There's what's more properly called anti-Judaism on the part of some earlier Greeks and now Romans. At the same time, we also have ample evidence that there were many co-citizens, I mean neighbors of Jews, who saw Jews as an ancient, thoughtful people who, they saw studying Torah in public as evidence that Jews were a philosophical people, and Jews are literally described that way, as a philosophical people, who are tempered and moderate and so forth. And there was a great deal of admiration, at least among some, of Jews and the system that they subscribe to. So I think not only ideally in this text, in the vision of the rabbis, but in terms of historical reality, there certainly would have been those whose approach would have been an approach that said, I recognize yours as a true and noble system, and that's what I want to enter. We should not underestimate during these centuries the frequency of conversion, particularly after the decline of the Roman Empire from its height in the 1st and 2nd century, the difficulties of the mid-2nd century, and particularly into the 3rd century. At that point, people throughout the empire were looking for ways to dignify their lives. They were afraid of what they saw in the world. And so there was a lot of conversion to new religious faiths, but also to ancient faiths. And Judaism, because of its antiquity, was often very much honored. Having said all of that, the Talmud does recognize motivation for marriage, for example. It does, interestingly, recognize motivation because you want to be accepted in the land of Israel, right? They thought the land of Israel was the best place on earth, and they thought that some people might convert in order to be able to make aliyah, as it were. And so that was considered to be an ingenuine motivation. They discuss these things. Ultimately, they want to push everyone to this direction. But now let's open up to the question of what else is going on here? And Rabbi Endelman, you mentioned before, the split between Sephardi and Ashkenazi. Let's not forget that interpretation always happens in two directions. It's never about an innocent interpretation of what a word means. We always ask ourselves what a word means if, usually unconsciously, we have a motivation for seeking one interpretation rather than another. And so I think kibbel means kabbalat all mitzvot, the way I suggested, and it means the entire system. I think that's the simple meaning of the term, but that doesn't mean that's the way it's going to be interpreted. But I suspect that the attitudes came before the interpretation, and that's what I'd like to show now. So there are two fundamental texts which include many of the most dominant interpretations of converts in connection to that statement that converts are as harmful or as difficult to the Jewish people as a scab. And I haven't translated them for you, but I've made them into outlines. Tosfot, for those of you who don't know, are the school of commentators who succeeded Rashi in Ashkenaz during the 12th century. This was a time of great intellectual flourishing in Ashkenaz, so northern France into the Rhineland. And these are individuals of great intellectual boldness and independence. It was such an age in France, and they benefited from the spirit of the age. But it's important, they were influential not just amongst Ashkenazi Jews. On the contrary, the Tosafistic way of reading earlier rabbinic text made its way through certain prominent rabbinic travelers to Spain. Already in the latter part of this 12th century into the 13th century and beyond. So we shouldn't think that this is an Ashkenazi versus a Sephardi approach. These are opinions that come to be reflected throughout the Jewish world. So let's just look at some of them and ask ourselves what they seem to suggest. So these are the explanations which Tosfot offer. And I do have to say this is an unusual number of explanations. It's very unusual to find this many interpretations. So you can see they're struggling with it. And I also have to add that though they offer all these interpretations, they don't accept all of them. Some of these are rejected in the course of the discussion, but only for technical reasons. So I think it's important to consider them despite their rejection. So number one, because converts are not expert in the commandments, and Jews learn from them, meaning from the converts. So the first explanation is that converts will be a bad influence, right? Because they don't know the system of the Torah so well. Number two, because all of Israel are responsible for one another. This is an ancient, a Talmudic legal category, and it suggests that when another Jew fails to fulfill their obligations, we, other Jews, have an obligation for them. So if converts fail in their responsibility to fulfill the mitzvot, it reflects not only on them, and it may not, I mean, surely it may influence us, but we may be liable for their failure. Number three is very important as we consider attitudes here, because they, converts that is to say, mix together with born Jews in marriage, and the Shekhinah, the divine presence, dwells only among families with pure descent. This touches on what I mentioned before from Judah Halevi and others, the racial piece of this, the notion that, and this goes back to antiquity, biblical antiquity, where we see how important the tribe was. You've got to marry in the tribe. And if the tribe is Jews, you've got to marry Jews. What does it mean to bring in someone technically as a Jew, but they don't have Jewish blood? And I think it's fair to use that term here. Well, it means that the divine presence will not dwell in your midst. And that's, of course, a problem. Because Israel, now look at how different the next one is, number 4. Because Israel was greatly warned with respect to oppression of converts. This goes back to the fact that the word in rabbinic Hebrew for convert is ger, which in biblical Hebrew doesn't mean convert, but resident alien. But the way the rabbis read the Hebrew Bible was every time they saw the word ger and the Torah's prohibition of oppressing the ger, they read it not as a prohibition of oppression of the resident alien, but of the convert. And they said, you know what, it's impossible to be sufficiently careful in this, because we all know that one way or the other, we're going to oppress the converts. My thought here is we've had several students come through JTS, one with whom I maintain regular contact. Several have been German women who look like your stereotype of Aryan German women. And they have reported to me that when they find themselves as rabbis or as rabbinical students in conservative synagogues, they find their identity as Jews challenged repeatedly. Comment of, well, where did you come from? Who are you really? That kind of challenge. And that is one of the kinds of oppression which Tosfot refers to here. We go to the other place where we find these. Some are repeated from Yevamot, but then you've got, number 1, because they're not expert in the commandments, they bring troubles. Right, less well defined, obviously related to 1 and 2 that came above, but it might be broader than that. Number 2, consider this, and it comes back to the last line of the Talmud, because on account of, I should say, of converts, on account of converts, meaning to attract converts, Israel is in exile. I'll come back to that in a moment because it's very important. And then, well, actually, you know what? Let me do 2 first. So the idea here is that attracting converts is so important, so much of a mitzvah, using the term that we had before, that in order to achieve it, God sent Israel into exile, because if Jews remain amongst Jews, then you're not going to win converts. The only way to attract converts is for Jews to be scattered throughout the world. And so as far as God was concerned, in this interpretation, exile is not about punishment as such in the common biblical view, but rather exile is about Israel's mission. Israel's mission is to model and spread the word of God, of Torah. That can only be done in exile, which comes with its burden, with its hardship. Nevertheless, on balance, it's considered to be so important that in God's view it was worth scattering Israel to assure that there would be converts. Very positive view. And then last but not least, in the opinion of someone named Rabbi Abraham the Convert, I should have capitalized the word convert there. He offers the interpretation that says, because converts are expert in the mitzvot and more punctilious, reminding God by comparison of Israel's sins. How often have I found myself in a contemporary conservative or other synagogue where some of the most committed leadership are actually converts, and they're surely doing a lot more than the native folks are doing. That, as I understand it, is Rabbi Avraham's claim, Avraham the convert, in this statement. This is very complex. Each one of these has a contemporary application. It really does lay out both the set of negative attitudes and their opposite. And I think it's worth our considering. You know, what does it mean to be other? It means not to be us, but then that reflects on the us. Are we a people in the racial sense? Are we a people in the sense of being members of a covenant? Does it dilute us? Does it pollute us if the foreigner becomes part of us? Some of the opinion here says yes. Some of the other opinion here says no. On the contrary, the person who begins as a non-Jew and becomes like us is just doing what we did when we stood at Sinai. And you'll notice, according to the great rabbinic myth, we all stood at Sinai. That was important because we had to convert to become members of that covenant. There's much more to say here, but we only have about 5-6 minutes, so I'll open up to whatever, comments get in here quickly enough. And Rabbi Endelman, please.
Great. Everyone has kept me on my toes today. Thank you. I went through all of the questions that have come in, and actually,
Wow.
I'm going to actually just turn off the chat now. Apologies. So I distilled them into 3 groups, and maybe you want to jot them down.
Yeah, I'm going to do that right now. Go ahead.
I don't think there will be time for all 3 of them, so you can choose. But I wanted to give voice to all of them. So one category of questions is about genealogy.
Mm-hmm.
Many people asked about conversos, or hidden closeted Jews.
Mm-hmm.
Should they be subject to conversion? And kind of related to that, the question of matrilineal descent as the definition of halachic Jewish identity. Where and when did that come from? So that's the genealogy category. There was another category of questions about other nations. So were other people at the time approaching conversion the same way our rabbinic ancestors were? And also a comment that from way back at the beginning of the text, that it's interesting that we define our Jewishness so deeply by other people's prejudice against Jews. We have so much content to share. So why is that so defining, the idea that other people hate us? So that's number 2. And then the third question that several people asked was conversion. It seems like conversion used to be so simple. When and why did we make it so hard?
Okay. So I think that's relatively easy, although very complex, and each leads to its own discussion, which we'll have to have at another time. Genealogy, conversos, there is a genealogical element to being a Jew. If your mother was a Jew, according to rabbinic law, then you are a Jew. As far as conversos are concerned, that leads to great difficulty because, of course, you would need to be able to trace back with some clarity, mother to mother to mother. That generally cannot be the case. So rabbinic authorities following the Spanish expulsion until the present day have generally recommended conversion to be sure. So, that's just a general observation. What about other nations and their conversion? Conversion is an interesting notion, concept. It does relate to patrilineal, matrilineal, first of all. In the Bible, Judaism was patrilineal. Under the rabbis, it became matrilineal. The transition seems to have been under the pressure of the recognition that you have to offer a motivation to become a Jew. If you can just join a Jewish household, and that makes you a Jew, and that the way you joined a household was entering the father's household. That's what it meant in a patriarchal society. So the way to demand an actual ceremony of conversion is to require that the mother be Jewish before you can be a Jew. And if your mother's not Jewish, you've got to go through conversion. Interestingly, Paul, as in the founder of Christianity, Paul, Paul's conversion came at the same time as his rejection of peoplehood. Conversion for Paul was a pure matter of belief. I might be going a little bit too far when I say pure, because what, after all, is 100% pure? But I mean, he rejected the notion of requiring Jewish people. It was about believing. And so, ironically, conversion is a religious category. It's not necessarily at the same time a citizen category, let alone a peoplehood category. The notion of being defined by that, the attitudes of others, and particularly their hatred of us. Here, I'm going to be very, very careful because I don't know whoever asked the question, and it may have been several people. While it is true, I lament it deeply because in modernity, not only recent modernity, but particularly recent modernity, Jewish identity has to a significant degree for many been about, I'm not going to let the anti-Semites get their way. I'm not going to let the Nazis win, or that kind of attitude. And I don't dismiss the importance of that. But you'll notice that the rabbis, while they speak of the difficulty of the position of Israel, that's not a matter of Jew hatred. It's a matter of a rebellious people called Judahites who had the chutzpah to rebel not once, but in large-scale ways twice and really 3 times against the Roman Empire, right? What kind of chutzpah is that? And so while Jew hatred has been part of Jewish identity, the way the other feels about you is always part of your identity, no matter what group you belong to and who you are. I think it's fair to say that on balance, that piece of Jewish identity weighs much more heavily in recent modernity than it did in the past. Of course, there was anti-Judaism, but no, when Jews were asked, what does it mean to be a Jew? Their first answer wasn't, well, our enemies hate us and they'll be damned. The answer was something more like, we are the people of the covenant of Torah, and this is a noble way of life, and this is the one to which we will remain committed. And even if you look at the world and it looks like they are on top and we are on bottom, the truth is that whatever our wealth, whatever our earthly power, in all reality, we are the ones who are dignified and noble, and not the other.
Dr. Kraemer, thank you so much. This was, we only scratched the surface. Maybe we need to do a whole course on this. This is an incredibly stimulating opening to the series. And I think even though we couldn't delve deeply into every issue that was raised, I think it really served to raise so many questions about identity and otherness that we'll be coming back to in many different ways over the course of the semester. So thank you so much for teaching today. I want to thank everyone for joining and invite you to join us back next week. We're going to be boomeranging back to modern times next week with Dr. Nancy Sinkoff, who is JTS alumna and now a professor at Rutgers. I think Rutgers.
Rutgers and a most excellent teacher.
And a wonderful teacher. And we're going to be looking at what she calls the mythic association between Jews and political liberalism in modern times by looking at the life of Lucy Debibitz. So it's going to be a wonderful session. I hope you will join us. I neglected to say at the beginning to everyone, happy 2021. I'm very pleased to kick off a new year of learning with you. And also that if that sponsorships for these webinars are available, if you're interested, please email learninglives@jtsa.edu. Thank you again to Dr. Kraemer, and we look forward to seeing you all again next week.
Nice to see all of you.